Good afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed lunch, and I hope you had a very good morning. I certainly did. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Nia and Holly and Emily for organizing it and for the kind invitation. My name is Guido van Meersbergen, and I teach global history at the University of Warwick, and I'm also the director of the Global History and Culture Center at the University of Warwick. And this session will be an hour, and I'll start by speaking about collaborations in global history at the Global History and Culture Center, and will introduce you to some of the international collaborations that we are engaged in. So that part of the session will take about 15 minutes, and then the main chunk of the session, which will be about half an hour, will be an attempt at sort of collaborative work in the room. So I took sort of the liberty to bring some sources with me and do a bit of group work, as I might do in seminars, as you might also do in your own teaching. And then we've got some time for a more general discussion at the end of that. So to start, to tell you something about the Global History and Culture Center. So as you can see, it was founded in 2007, so it's been around for 16 years. And Professor Maxine Berg, who has recently retired, was the founding director. She was also a consultant on one of the earlier AM resources, global commodities. And global commodities is one of the main focus, the main areas of focus of historians at the University of Warwick. So that fitted very nicely. We are quite a large center. We've got about 50 staff and students, postgraduate students who are members with really varied, wide-ranging expertise. So we've got several colleagues who are experts on Latin America. We've got several Africanists and other people like myself focused primarily on Asia. So I'm a historian primarily of the East India Company. So that's the other main AM resource that I've used over the years actively in my research and also in teaching. Another area of focus that we are strong at is the history of science, the history of technology, and environmental history. Actually, one of our colleagues is a mathematician by training. So we heard this morning about historians of mathematics. Sometimes they actually graduate to or sort of move on to work in history department. She actually is now a historian of food in a global context. Our other global historian of science trained as a computer scientist. So we are quite interdisciplinary in that sense. And one of the things that I think we are distinct in doing is that we have a lot of international collaborative projects with colleagues, historians based in other parts of the world. And some of them are the three projects that I'm myself involved with and that I'm going to be telling you just briefly a couple of things about. So the first one that you're seeing here, which is based in Japan, it's funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. So it's a Japan-funded project of Japanese global historians who applied with an international partner, which was the Global History and Culture Center at the University of Warwick. So it means that we are, in that sense, we are the UK partner of this set of historians at different institutions across Japan, and it also means that we have the opportunity to host global historians from Japan from time to time. And one of the key things that sort of brings our conversations together is that of what we call categories at work in global history. And the question really here that motivates these discussions is when we are doing our individual research, when we are reading our sources, categories don't necessarily translate very well between languages. Take something, so I'm a historian of the East India Company as well as diplomacy. Take something as a treaty, as a contract, the concept of an ambassador, the concept of diplomacy itself. These are all concepts that are themselves the product of particular historical developments in particular parts of the world. When an organization like the East India Company might trade in Japan, they might have a very clear understanding of what a treaty or a contract is. That doesn't mean that to Japanese actors in that period, these things, these concepts mean the same thing. But even it also doesn't mean that to Japanese historians today, when they speak of, say, when they're using concepts such as, say, race or class or any kind of other larger sort of conceptual frameworks that we are using in our research, they don't necessarily translate between cultural and institutional and linguistic context. So that is one of the key areas of focus of that collaboration. We have got a collaboration going on with Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. The poster that you see here is of a workshop that we did in April that has focused much more also on issues of access, on issues also of Eurocentrism within global history scholarship. The fact that most of the key methodological and conceptual sort of approaches are quite deeply rooted in Anglo-American academic cultures and spaces, that concepts from the global south haven't circulated as easily, and the reasons for that. And the third project, which is a collaboration between Warwick and the European University Institute in Florence, actually builds on that, expands on that, but beyond the context of South Asia. So here we have colleagues involved from Latin America, from Africa, from other countries in Asia as well, where we, again, are focusing on what are the inequalities that are structuring essentially research in global history globally. Why is it indeed that the most prestigious presses tend to feature very few scholars who are not based in the UK, in the US, in some other more elitist parts of global academia, primarily in continental Europe? This also relates to sources because it speaks to questions of access. If most of the archives are based in say, the UK, it means that it makes it much harder to access it, not just for reasons of travel cost, but also for reasons of access to the country itself. So visa and border regimes become very important. So questions of inequalities in global history, what does it mean to achieve or try to work towards a global history that's in that sense less unequal, that's more attuned to the contributions conceptually and otherwise of scholars working in all different parts of the world. That's something that is very much animating our discussions there. A few other projects, again, that I'm involved with myself, that in several ways are also trying to address the question of Eurocentrism in global history research, the questions of creating new narratives. For instance, the Global Diplomacy Network is trying to collectively, through collaboration between scholars in different parts of the world, to produce, to generate a new understanding of the development of the process and practice of international relations, which doesn't start and end with Western institutions, Western actors, Western concepts. We have a lot of people who are working on diplomacy in Asia and other parts of the world as well, but their work tends to be seen as part of, say, regional histories, but doesn't quite feed into the global narratives about the development of diplomacy at an international level. So that's one of the things that we are doing there. The sort of the third project that I listed here, that's also related to some of the sources that I brought, which is of a slightly different nature. That's actually a project that is seeking to result in a text edition. So an edition, a critical edition of the diaries of this one ambassador whose name was Sir William Norris, who came from Britain, and he was sent to Mughal India in 1699 and then stays there for 3 years. I'll tell you a little bit about this embassy and a little bit about the type of work that we are doing, and then this will also lead into the first activity with the sources. So here on the map you can get a bit of a sense. Oh, sorry, I'm working with my laptop independently, so I apologize actually because the two don't speak to each other. So these are some of the projects that I mentioned just now, and this is the map that I wanted to draw your attention to. So this was the second time that a British royal ambassador was sent to Mughal India. The first time was at the beginning of the 17th century. That wasn't a success. The East India Company didn't think it was worth the expenditure. There were other forms of more informal and less costly diplomacy that they continued to engage in. At the very end of the 17th century, however, the situation had changed in the sense that the existing London-based East India Company had come to be challenged by a new East India Company that was called the New East India Company, but officially the English East India Company, to emphasize its difference from the old London-based one. This New East India Company was founded in 1698, was chartered by King William III, and also the old East India Company, the existing one, was its charter was not going to be renewed, so it was told to be terminated just a few years later. That actually never happens. So the old East India Company continues to exist. The two East India Companies end up merging in the early 18th century and becoming the United East India Company, the British East India Company that we know in the 18th century. Now, why does this matter? It matters because of the fact that this new East India Company that didn't really have the same kind of experience in India that the old one already had gathered after a century of presence there, decided that it would be a good idea to send another royal ambassador, partly to assert its own claims to authority over the other Englishmen who were already in India, partly to announce that the old East India Company was going to cease to exist, but also to acquire trading privileges for this new organization and fix a problem that had been plaguing Indian shipping actually in the 1690s, which was a problem of European piracy. So there were European pirates that were attacking Indian ships. The authorities in India were holding the official representatives of the various Europeans who were in India, which were the different East India Companies, accountable for this fact, and essentially were setting them an ultimatum: either you pay up, or you protect our ships, or you leave the country. So if you want to continue to trade, you're going to need to handle this problem of piracy. And one of the things that Norris set out was to try to solve this deadlock, essentially because the Europeans weren't willing to pay up in the way that the Mughal emperor was requesting from them. What you can see on this map is that Norris's route was very indirect. He arrives in Masulipatam, which is on the east coast of India. He wants to make his way to the Mughal court, which at this time is in southern India and the Deccan, because the emperor was campaigning against his sort of eternal foes, the Marathas. Norris doesn't succeed in getting the logistics in order. It becomes a waiting game. He is waiting for permission to travel. He's waiting for letters of safe conduct. It doesn't happen. He gets fed up and decides to try his luck from the opposite coast and sails to Surat in Western India. Actually, the first of the sources that I brought is a description of his first arrival in Surat, so we'll look at it in a minute. From there, he does make his way to the court. Sort of spoiler, he doesn't succeed in any of his aims. Grows again frustrated. It takes a long time. It's very costly. He has to deal with a lot of political factions that he doesn't really understand, and eventually he concludes, I'm not going to be able to achieve what I set out to do. I might as well go home, essentially makes his way back to Surat, boards a ship and dies at sea. So he also doesn't make it back to England. So that is essentially the story. The short of it is that it was a failed embassy. The longer story is that we have an incredible archive that details what was in political terms a failed embassy, but in terms of understanding, one, the political situation of Mughal India at the time, two, the conflict between these two East India companies, three, the various cultural interactions and the ways how these different diplomatic actors from different parts of the world are trying to understand one another's conceptions of diplomacy, try to understand how to find the best ways of achieving their ends in situations often of sort of cultural mistranslation and misunderstanding. So for that reason, there we go. Together with, by now, 4 colleagues, we've got a big project team going on. We have set ourselves the task, and actually this has been a project long in the making because we're all doing this alongside other things, of transcribing and then correcting the transcriptions and then eventually editing in terms of creating footnotes and an introduction and eventually publishing these diaries. This brings me back also to AM. The diaries themselves, they aren't on any of the AM platforms. They are actually, 2 of them are held in the Bodleian in Oxford, 2 are held in Kew, but many additional volumes of correspondence, you can actually access them through the East India Company platform. Interestingly, not all the material is in English. There's also actually quite a bit in Persian, which was the language of administration and of government of the Mughal Empire. And these additional materials, they are way more voluminous than the volumes themselves. So we've got 4 volumes out of original 6 of diaries, and here you can get possibly a sense of the handwriting. It's very tricky handwriting. It took us some time to get properly comfortable with it. This is Norris's own hand. Actually, the irony here is that Norris's hand was much more awful than that of many of his scribes. So when we are reading copies of his letters, it's actually often much more friendly on the eye. And I suppose, yeah, this takes me then to, this sort of concludes my introduction to some of the sources that I brought with me that are on your table. So I divided them into 2 sets. So one of the sets is containing an extract from Norris's diary describing his arrival in Surat. That's the printout. Then the other source pertaining to the Norris embassy is essentially a Persian copy with, in the margin, a contemporary English translation of a request that he sent to an official in the Mughal administration called Mirza Yar Ali Beg, who was appointed to facilitate the communications between the court and this foreign ambassador. So I've got a couple of questions here that I think might sort of guide the conversation, but really I'd like to have this open. The other 2 sources will leave it for the second activity. So the idea here is that you don't need to read it fully through. It might be a bit much, but maybe as a group, you can maybe divide the sources. Some people might look at one and some people might look at the other, and try to form some notions of, what do these kind of sources tell? What are the kind of challenges that they pose? How might we use them for sources in global history? So what are the themes that they shed light on, the kind of insights we can derive from them? But also, in what ways is collaboration really the mode that they require, that they call for in order to best obtain a rounded understanding of these materials? So I think, how much time will I give? Why don't I give you 5 minutes at your table to take a look and have an initial discussion, and then we can pull ideas together collectively. Yeah, so let's see if we can get some initial responses. Which table had a look at the embassy diary extract? Shall we start there? Who would like to maybe share their initial response. I know that to sort of properly engage with a text like that, you need to do a bit more, maybe sort of close reading than you had time for, but are there any sort of initial responses, suggestions to, what could you do with a source like that? What might the challenges be of using it, be it in the classroom, be it as a researcher? Please, yeah.
So it kind of describes a lot of the content. You go full.
Do I win something from a 90s game show?
Yeah.
The answer is correct.
I'll try. It talks a lot about the pomp and ceremony that kind of people that happened when this William Norris sort of arrived in Surat. And so we were just discussing kind of how we might interpret the gun salutes and all of it, and this was an honor that was given to his sons but not his grandsons. So you can get an idea of the level of respect or kind of prestige that's being given. A couple of the difficulties, we were intrigued that some of the letters are in italics. We weren't really sure if there was a reason for random letters being like that. Also, the spelling is obviously different. There's all these people that we don't know who they are. There's a lot of places that the name changes might have changed since he was writing, so we don't know where they are. Just a lot of things to follow up.
Yeah, I think on the italics, maybe I should have told you that. That's actually the interpolation that we did as part of the transcription. So these are actually contractions that so following the house style of this particular publisher, we have written them out, but putting the interpolated words in italics, which means that what you're looking at here is actually a curated text. It's not just a transcription, it also means that all the contractions like the will be written like a Y with superscript E, that like a Y with superscript T, there like a Y with superscript R, and I can go on like that. And other words indeed will be more immediately sort of apparent if it's comp for company, but others less so, and therefore, we have followed this, this house style and supplied some of the names in the footnotes as well. I think another point that where you started with here is about Norris laying claim to this distinction in his reception, right? So this is a distinction that is only accorded to very few people, and I'm one of them. So I think part of the purpose of these diaries is justification to people back home. Partly it's essentially laying claim. I see some nodding here, so actually, rather than saying more, I'm actually going to ask this table. Please, could you speak?
It's not really about whether it's who he was writing for, who he was writing for, and if it all goes wrong, it's not my fault because actually I've crossed all the I's and crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and so that was whether he was going to be writing an autobiography or whether he was preparing for failure already, and it wasn't my fault. I don't know, things like that.
So it is about accountability. So yeah, you're absolutely right about this. So these diaries, they are they're not personal memoirs. They are an accounting of his actions because he knows that he will be held to account by an audience back home, which is in this case the king, the court, and the East India Company, which also makes it difficult because he's got essentially multiple audiences to please. What he also needs to do is to make his own actions in India acceptable to his immediate audience, which are the Mughal dignitaries, the officials, the courtiers there. So when we read between the lines, we can also get a sense of how he would have been perceived and received within the hierarchical structure of Mughal India. At several points, not necessarily here, but in the diary, he makes claims that this is essentially the highest form of honor and distinction that a European representative can expect to receive in this court in this country. So essentially the point that he is making is to say, perhaps to a European reader unfamiliar with the context, it might appear that I have been excessively humble, that I've been excessively submissive, but let me reassure you, I absolutely have done everything that I could possibly do within that context to uphold the honor of my monarch. So that is actually his sort of rhetorical ploy throughout the diaries. Are there other tables who would like to comment?
Hear from you, if you could get hold of them. I know scholars have, but they don't start reading what the local actually says when they've been with Western people coming in, that they have very different accounts. Or hear what the governor actually said when he was very pleased with the gift. So I think there's just the more sources you can lay on top of this source, you then start getting some really interesting insights.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's absolutely the dream is having an archive where you can do that. It's not a reality here, but we do have. So what we don't have is any independent Mughal sources that describe Norris. But what we do have is Norris carrying back with him copies of official documents that were sent to him, which in the language used, in the formulaic language used. So, one of the challenges is that it's not just about understanding the Persian of the time, it's also about understanding the conventions of writing in a particular register. But once you can read it through that lens with the knowledge of that particular register, what was the kind of distinction that was actually accorded to Norris in relation to, say, the Persian ambassador, the Uzbek ambassador, other emissaries at this same court, we are able to see that Norris's claims are also quite inflated. So he wasn't received as a very important figure. He does his utmost to claim that for himself, but also because he has to contend with multiple audiences who were able to discredit him, and also with their own agenda. So one of the audiences that was seeking to discredit him for their own reasons was the Old East India Company, who were being undermined by this interloper in their eyes. On the other document, are there people who would like to sort of share some thoughts that came out of that conversation on the, so that's the letter to Yar Ali Beg.
So it's challenging to read. I think that was, everyone found that slightly. But I think it does show a really interesting relationship between the written word, and I think there is definitely something to be said for seeing a person's handwriting and the way they record their events as they see them in a much more tangible sense in this kind of document. Mm-hmm. Can I ask, so the Persian translation, is that been done after? Like, what sort of, were they both written here? Like, how was that come to be altogether?
So the translation is contemporary, as in made at the time. If there's a short time lag, like quite if it was written down, in the moment or with a slight time lag, I actually cannot say. But it was archived as part of the documents that were sent back, in this year, it's 1701. So it was created in the same year.
It's interesting. I mean, we did speak about it, and we got the first bit and we kind of got the last bit, but the middle section was a little bit harder to read. And I think without specific context for these documents, it is quite a challenge, isn't it, to kind of dissect the exact narrative. Mm-hmm. But I suppose when he ends on, when he says, "I hope in a little time to have the happiness of being introduced to your," is it? Some of the preference of the great emperor, your majesty. It's quite a note to end on. It's quite, there's lofty heights, I think, being expressed there.
Absolutely. And this is actually an example where the sort of the loftiness of the tone is even still relatively subdued compared to some others. Persian writing had this, so the Persian epistolary conventions were extremely flowery, and so honorific addresses and honorific salutes and describing oneself as your humble slave, and those kind of terminology were absolutely standard and therefore expected. And as a result, the translations being done by scribes, very often local translators who would be hired by the East India companies, but who had training in the local epistolary culture. The European, say the English draft, would not just be translated, it would also be sort of, there was a cultural translation going on as well. It would be stylized in a way that would be acceptable. And the Europeans originally writing those texts were often unhappy about it. They would say that, you know, you twisted my words, this is not what I actually said. And then the response to that would typically be, look, if we had written it exactly, if we had translated it word for word, if we had written it in the way that you had originally written it, A, it would probably not be understood. It would just seem really odd. And B, you would probably have offended the recipient and therefore not achieved your ends. So this kind of cultural translation and adjustment to the Persian epistolary culture was very strong here. In this case, actually, it's interesting because I asked a colleague to, so one of the forms of collaboration on this project is that some of the Persian materials I have asked a colleague, or we were able to hire someone to help us with translations. And actually, in this case, the translation, that final bit that you mentioned, it didn't actually appear in the original. So this is actually also a form of the English translation and the Persian not matching fully, but actually the honorific bit in the final sentence. That was a sort of an English version of what an honorific bit could be. Whereas I've seen others where to an English reader, it feels like this is much more a literal translation from the Persian, because this is full of phraseology that are very clearly direct translations with references that are Islamic or that are from, say, the Persianate tradition of kingship that wouldn't be part of a European draft in the first place. Okay, so mindful of time here, we have another set of sources. They are of slightly different nature. So actually the sources that I've showed you now before, I have never brought them into the classroom, and partly for the reason that the last colleague mentioned. With the lack of context, it's actually harder to work with them. The sources that the second set of sources, they actually are sources that I use in the classroom in different modules. The map of Barbados that actually is found in a book. You can see it on the slide here. That's also on the Global Commodities Resource of AM, so under sugar. And the Imperial Airways timetable is, again, I shouldn't have asked for a laptop that doesn't speak to the slide. But thank you for providing it anyway. Okay, the second one, now they're back on the screen, is a primary source that I use in a module which is about the global history of travel. And we are looking essentially at all sorts of materials that relate to experiences of global travel, and this is about early air travel with Imperial Airways, so within the context of the British Empire. So similarly, take some minutes as a group to look at either or both of them, and you know, maybe sort of just again some questions that might guide the discussion. How might you use them in research and teaching? What are the kinds of issues that you can study through these kind of materials? And you know, within the theme of reimagining primary sources, how do they actually help us to reimagine the topics that they deal with? So yeah, please take another 5 minutes as a group. Who would like to maybe start us off with an initial response on what you might do with sources like these? What are the kind of issues that you might use them to study? What you found maybe striking about them? Please.
Sorry, just looking at the map of Barbados.
Yes.
And I work with a lot of collections relating to transatlantic slavery, and one of the things we're always looking for is acts of resistance. So the north corner of the top of the map,
Yes.
where you can see, just
I don't have a pointer, but it's
Yeah.
yes.
because you can see people being chased,
No,
we
that
would
wasn't-
kind of, I think the curatorial teams that I work with would be interested in that because it shows conflict, and conflict implies resistance.
Absolutely. It shows violence, it shows coercion, probably a runaway, an enslaved person who has escaped and is being chased by an overseer, or two figures who are seeking to escape, being shot at. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think when I look at this with students, one of the things that that often gets remarked upon as one of the earliest things. I think it's really eye-catching. Are there other things that, so indeed, for history of resistance and the violence of slavery, it really depicts that. Are there other things that struck you, please?
So one of the joys of my job is I get to meet lots of different curators and speak to them about different material types and content. And when I first met with our head of maps at the time, he said that the interesting thing about maps is everyone thinks that they're a topographical thing, and they're not. They're very political, and they tell a story, and they actually have an agenda. And I think this map absolutely demonstrates that it's not a map of Barbados. It's an insight into how that map writer was thinking at the time and the things they were trying to highlight.
Yeah, so what are some of the things that you think they meant to highlight?
Well, actually, it's very long to look at it. So, but things like the ownership of land, and the main one was the one we just referred to on the table earlier, which was the shooting of the people at the top and trying to run away. But yeah, it's all about who owns what rather than what the geographical references are, I think.
Yeah, so who owns what is very central in this particular map. It's actually in the subtitle, if you could read it, with the master's names for the several plantations. And all along the southern coastline, or the western and southern coastline, you see backed up one against each other the names of the owners of these various plantations. So in that sense, it's a map. Was this something that another group had meant to say? I thought maybe I saw sort of a gesture. In that sense, it's quite a unique document also of indeed of ownership, of claims of ownership over this land, and the plantations, the sugar plantations, and their geography and their location, along the western and southern shores of the island. Any further aspects? Was there a hand up here? Please.
Sorry, I want to talk to the Imperial Airways.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's move to that one.
So one thing that struck us when we looked at the Imperial Airways one, apart from doing the timeline between the Imperial Airways going to BOAC, BEA and now British Airways, is the fact that most European carriers, it's almost like a post-colonial hangover when you look at their route maps. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the British Airways route map now in the Highlights magazine, or as they hand out these days, the route map is very much based on the British Commonwealth and Empire. So that route through Africa out towards India, if you look at the British Airways route map now, it's very, very similar. And when you look at Air France, they're very strong in West Africa. If you look at Lufthansa, they go down to Namibia, and so on and so forth. So it sort of plays out through history, where those historic links, cultural links and trade links are still playing out in global aviation today.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and this is something that applies to railways in the way that it applies to airlines as well. I remember a recent talk by an archaeologist who does digs in Iraq, and she said the only places in Iraq where you actually still have railway connections are the ones that essentially are, will not be appearing on this one, but if you're looking at railway timetables from the same period, the British mandate in Iraq and what they built at the time. So yeah, that's a very good observation. Some of those lines, this is very clearly connecting the empire. Some of the also Imperial Airways, the same company around the same time, they were issuing these prospectuses where they had little labels for each city, and it's very clear that those labels are very Orientalist, and B, very much about promoting connections within the empire. So it will say, for instance, for South Africa, here is gold, or here are diamonds. So the kind of, these kind of brief labels that are essentially about promoting investment, promoting mobility to these places within the framework of the empire.
And for students to see that now, to see language like imperial, like British imperialism, which is a completely awful thing, and it would be a swear word amongst a 20-year-old, and the copy here is celebrating empire building, imperialism. There is no reference to any culture you might witness when you get on these incredible air machines. You're just basically getting, like you just said, if you want to get down to South Africa to, get more gold, off you go. So I think students would find it fascinating.
Absolutely. And the other aspect here is that when the references are to particular cultural spaces, it's classic Orientalist quite often in the sense of frozen in time. So for sites in the Middle East, it would say, the land of Sinbad, or those kind of. So it's about the references to a sort of mythical, frozen in the past land. Do we have? Let me actually check. I think actually we don't have a great amount of time, and I think it would be good maybe to say let's have a few maybe minutes to round it off with some possible general questions. I put a couple of sort of suggested things on this slide about using sources within global history. What forms should collaborations take? Issues of access, I think it's very important, and also when we're speaking about digitization, it doesn't necessarily mean access for everyone. This is also related to resources. Acquisition of materials remains a big issue globally when it comes to who can actually use the kind of materials that we are discussing. So yeah, maybe linking it to the different kind of collaborations that within the Global History and Culture Center we are engaged with, which are about equitable access and equitable sort of collaborative practices. But any other sort of comments and questions are also very welcome.
Yeah, just thinking on that last point, so when we've talked about this, it's quite interesting to see how The Guardian, for example, have been looking at their legacy of slavery, and they're actually doing, it's like a positive reparations. So is there a sense that you don't just kind of say, hey, these archives are available, how do you actually encourage the democratization or the decolonizing or the use of these documents and things by people who have been affected by the colonialists?
Yeah, I think this is a question for the institutions that are holding the collections in the first place, right? So I think you gave the example of The Guardian. Quite a few heritage institutions have been taking those steps. And then there are other heritage institutions where there is resistance. So National Trust is an example where some of the membership is highly resistant to this. For instance, the Natural History Museum, nowadays when you go both on their website and physically in London, they will have explanations about essentially their move towards decolonizing the narratives that their collections tell, and they're very communicative about that. So I think it is a question of redistribution in some ways, as well as access. So access as in who are invited actively into the institution to help shape the narratives that the institution tell. It's about ownership. So not just about the same group of people within the institution trying to tell a different story. So it's not just about listening, it is also about accepting that then sometimes the people engaged with will disagree with the line that even with good intentions that the institution might be taking. So giving up some of that space is actually crucial to that, but also redistribution in some ways it is about resources. It is about repatriation of materials, or indeed some of the funding might go towards making available open access materials that are digitized but that currently have a cost attached to it to researchers in countries where the current costs are prohibitive.
Just on that question, actually, Guido, maybe just directed at you. So when you're using sources like this, for example, there's obviously a sort of an incumbent responsibility on the holding archive, on the publisher to contextualize, to do a lot of that preparatory work. But actually, from the point of view of being an instructor in a classroom, presenting a document like this, how do you go about bringing in those perspectives and trying to ensure that you're kind of covering all that sort of range? Is that through inclusion of third parties coming in to kind of add those contexts? Is it through additional research? How would you go about contextualizing from the point of view of teaching?
Yeah, that is a great question. So when the opportunity is there to, say, take students into a museum where there will be a curator who is much better placed than I am to speak about these materials, then that is obviously ideal and preferable. When it comes to a day-to-day teaching, it is about assuming some responsibility over, in the first place, I think engaging the students with scholarship that is both qualified and sensitive in its ability to deal with these issues. And using that, I think, to inform the discussion is crucial in the first place. Being careful about presenting students materials in a more contextualized fashion than, admittedly I was able to do here, or that I did here, by spending more time on a particular source so that you can offer a thicker reading of it, contextualize it also in relation to other readings that you might have done already in previous weeks that you might set them for that week. So I suppose those are the ways I would do this in teaching. Yeah, and being open to the conversation, as in inviting students. Very often students bring incredibly rich perspectives into the classroom. So not standing there with the intention of telling the students how to read a document, but at the same time sort of guiding them towards what you believe are at least some of the outcomes that are valuable when engaging with a document like that. Okay, I think time's up. So thank you all very much. We have another break, so please enjoy the tea and coffee. Thank you very much.